Good morning, survivors. You're listening to The Graveyard, and this is Atlas speaking from somewhere that hasn't yet crumbled to dust. The time is 3:47 a.m., though let's be honest, does it really matter anymore? Night and day have become relative out here, just markers of when it's safer to move and when it's better to stay hidden. It's been 5 days since my last broadcast. 5 long, strange, and dangerous days. I'll spare you the details of why the silence, but let's just say that being alive to talk to you now was a very close call. The world's been getting louder in its warnings, hasn't it? Or maybe quieter, depending on where you are. That oppressive silence I talked about last time, it's spreading. I'll get to that soon enough, but first, let's start with what's right in front of us. The weather. Yes, even now, when the sky is more enemy than friend, it still finds ways to keep us guessing. I've had reports coming in from those of you brave enough to reach out. A sudden downpour, like a curtain of rain slamming down without warning, and leaving behind this ash-like residue. No smell, no immediate effects, but at night it glows faintly, like embers in a dying fire. One survivor claimed they saw it clinging to their boots hours after the rain had stopped, as if it had a mind of its own. What is it? No clue. Could be fallout. Could be something else entirely. My advice? Don't touch it. Don't let it linger on your skin. And if you've already come into contact with it, monitor yourself closely. We don't need another mystery on top of everything else. And while we're on the topic of weather, has anyone else noticed how the wind seems to be moving in patterns? Subtle, but it's there. Gusts that swirl back on themselves, almost like the world is breathing. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. But weather isn't the only thing changing out there. The animals, they're not right. I had a report from a group passing through the old highway near what used to be the eastern stretch of farmland. Wolves, a whole pack of them, just circling a group of infected. Not attacking, not defending, just watching. And then there are the birds. Survivors near the riverbanks saw flocks of them hovering, perfectly still, over the same spot for hours before scattering in perfect formation. It's as if they've become witnesses to this mess, observers in a way we can't understand. Are they adapting? Reacting? I don't have answers, but I do know this. When animals start doing things they shouldn't, it's time to pay attention. Now, for the infected. If you thought they couldn't get any stranger, think again. I've received multiple reports of infected guarding specific areas. I'm not talking about random wandering or clustering. They're forming barriers, standing shoulder to shoulder around certain landmarks. And here's the kicker. They don't react unless you cross some invisible line. One survivor described it as walking into a trap, but not springing it until they got too close. What's behind those barriers? Supplies? Something worse? Your guess is as good as mine, but if you see a cluster acting like sentinels, my advice is to turn around and find another way. There's nothing worth breaking their perimeter for. And then there's the mimicry. Survivors have spotted infected copy movements, crouching when we crouch, pointing when we point. At first, it might seem like a coincidence, but the more you watch, the more deliberate it feels. Are they learning? Testing? Maybe it's just some broken wiring in their brains. Either way, it's unnerving and it's dangerous. If they're evolving, it's not just about avoiding them anymore. It's about staying unpredictable ourselves. I'll leave it there for now, but keep this in mind. The world is changing faster than we can adapt. These updates are just a piece of the puzzle. The rest, that's for us to figure out together. Stay sharp, survivors. This is just the beginning of tonight's broadcast. Let's talk about the land itself, survivors. If you're out there moving from place to place, you've probably noticed how the ground feels different. Some survivors have reported patches of earth that seem softer, almost spongy, even in areas where the soil was once dry and cracked. It's not mud or wet ground. It's something else. One listener described stepping into it and feeling a faint vibration beneath their boots, as if the earth was humming. They pulled back immediately, and good thing too, because not long after, the ground in that area collapsed into a sinkhole. It wasn't a natural sinkhole either. The edges spiraled down like a whirlpool frozen in dirt. If you're traveling on foot, test the ground ahead of you. A few extra seconds of caution could save your life. Then there are the trees. If you're heading into wooded areas, you might want to keep an eye on the bark. In some regions, survivors have seen trees with spiraling patterns etched into their trunks, as though carved by an unseen hand. The patterns glow faintly at night, similar to the residue left by the rain. One survivor even claimed to see a group of infected standing perfectly still beneath one of these trees, their heads tilted upward as if staring at something just out of sight. It's unsettling, to say the least. Whatever these markings are, they're not natural. Avoid them if you can. Speaking of avoiding things, I want to address a troubling trend I've been hearing about: traps. They're everywhere now, and they're getting more creative. It's not just tripwires or pits anymore. Survivors have reported elaborate setups designed to lure the desperate and unwary. A pristine backpack left in the middle of a deserted street, untouched vending machines with intact glass, and even piles of supplies that look too good to be true. They are too good to be true. One survivor nearly lost their leg to a spring-loaded spike trap hidden beneath a stash of canned goods. Whoever's setting these traps knows what they're doing. They're not just scavengers, they're predators. So, if you see something that feels out of place, trust your gut. There's always a catch. And it's not just the traps. Survivors themselves are becoming harder to predict. Some are banding together, forming groups that move with military precision, while others have turned to outright ambush tactics. A listener reported a run-in with what they thought was a friendly group offering trade. It turned out to be a setup, with the so-called traders leading them into an alley where they were surrounded. Thankfully, they escaped, but it's a harsh reminder that trust is a luxury we can't afford right now. If you're traveling alone, stay out of sight. If you're in a group, keep your numbers small and your movements quiet. The fewer people who know about you, the better. But it's not all bad news. In the middle of all this chaos, there are still whispers of people trying to do good. I heard about a group of survivors leaving care packages in abandoned vehicles, marked with a white X. These packages contain essentials: water, canned food, medical supplies. The group operates anonymously, leaving no trace other than the supplies themselves. If you come across a vehicle with a white X, it might be worth checking, but do so carefully. Even good intentions can attract the wrong kind of attention. Now let's turn to the rivers. If you're near one, you've probably noticed the currents behaving strangely. In some areas, the water flows in erratic patterns, reversing direction or spiraling in on itself. There have even been reports of glowing blue lights beneath the surface, similar to the residue from the rain. One survivor claimed to see something moving in the water, just out of reach of their flashlight beam. They described it as a shadow, larger than any fish or animal they'd expect to find. Whatever it was, it didn't follow them, but the experience left them shaken. My advice: avoid the water if you can. Stick to dry land and find another way across. The rivers aren't safe anymore, if they ever were. Before I move on, I want to address something I've been hearing more of lately: whispers. Survivors have reported hearing faint voices in areas that should be completely deserted. These aren't the guttural sounds of the infected or the echo of someone shouting in the distance. They're softer, almost conversational, like you've just walked into the middle of a discussion. The voices never get louder or closer, and they don't seem to come from any one direction. Some have speculated it's just the wind, playing tricks on us, but others aren't so sure. Whatever it is, don't let it distract you. Keep your focus and keep moving. All right, survivors, let's keep this moving. There's still a lot to cover, and time is never on our side. Let's talk about the infected. Whatever this plague is, it's changing them, and not in ways we can explain. Reports are coming in from all directions, describing infected moving with what can only be called intent. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. They're not the same mindless husks we saw in the early days. They're hunting, yes, but there's more to it than that now. Survivors have spotted infected forming patterns. Yes, patterns. A group of 20 or so stood in a perfect circle around a street lamp, heads tilted back as if staring at the bulb, even though it wasn't lit. Another group was seen standing shoulder to shoulder along the edge of a ravine, completely still. No noise, no movement, just staring into the void. What's worse is how they're responding to us. I've received multiple accounts of infected actively avoiding traps set by survivors. They're learning or something is guiding them. One listener described how they watched an infected skirt a tripwire and lead others away from it. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, and frankly, neither can I. If they're truly capable of strategy now, then the rules of survival are shifting beneath our feet. If you're still relying on old tricks to outsmart them, it's time to rethink your approach. Always assume they're one step ahead. Then there's the matter of their clustering behavior. Survivors passing through abandoned lots and parking garages have reported groups of infected standing unnervingly still, almost like statues. But the moment a sound breaks the silence, be it a dropped can or a cough, the entire group moves as one. It's like watching a hive mind at work. The infected don't just scatter. They converge, as if coordinated by something unseen. If you're traveling in urban areas, keep your noise to an absolute minimum. These clusters aren't just lurking anymore. They're waiting. Now let's pivot to something stranger, if you can believe it. Survivors are reporting anomalies in abandoned structures. I received a detailed account from a listener who took refuge in an old office building. They described entering what looked like a normal lobby, only to find that every door led back to the same room. No matter which hallway they took or how many stairs they climbed, they always ended up in that same spot. They eventually broke a window to escape, only to find themselves stepping out onto a ground level that didn't match where they'd entered. I'm not saying the buildings themselves are changing, but, well, what other explanation is there? If you find yourself in a place that doesn't feel right, trust your instincts and get out. Other survivors have noted strange symbols appearing on walls, etched into the concrete or scratched into paint. Spirals, jagged lines, and what look like overlapping triangles. One survivor even found these symbols burned into the side of a car. The unsettling part, they swear that car wasn't there the day before. These markings often appear near places where infected are behaving unusually, or in areas where the air feels heavier, charged. If you see them, be on your guard. Something about them feels deliberate, and I can't shake the feeling that they're meant to send a message, though who or what is leaving them remains a mystery. Speaking of messages, I've been hearing about notes left in odd places. Scraps of paper pinned to trees, carved into desks, or scrawled in ash on the ground. They say things like, "Run, don't look back," or "The sky listens." A few survivors have reported more detailed warnings, like, "Stay out of the fog," or "It's in the roots." What's haunting is how these messages often appear in areas where something unnatural has already been reported. It's almost as if someone or something knows where danger is and is trying to warn us, though not always in time. Now, I want to circle back to something I touched on briefly in the last part. Whispers. Survivors are still reporting voices in deserted areas, and these voices aren't just faint murmurs anymore. Some have heard full sentences, though the words are often garbled, like a broken radio transmission. One listener told me they heard their name being called, clear as day, in a place they knew they were alone. They didn't investigate, and I'm grateful for their caution. If you hear something that doesn't belong, keep moving. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Finally, there's the matter of reflections. Mirrors, puddles, glass. Survivors have been noticing oddities. One survivor described seeing their own reflection move differently, lagging behind their actual movements by a fraction of a second. Another said they saw someone else entirely in their reflection, standing where they should have been. They smashed the mirror and left immediately, but the memory still haunts them. If you're in a place with reflective surfaces, it might be worth covering them or avoiding them altogether. I don't know what's happening with these reflections, but whatever it is, it's not normal. The world is changing, survivors, faster than we can adapt. Every day brings something new, something stranger. Stay vigilant and stay sharp. We're navigating uncharted territory now. Let's shift focus to practical survival for a moment. No matter how strange the world gets, some rules remain constant. Stay hidden, stay moving, and always stay prepared. I've received reports from survivors experimenting with reflective surfaces as tools of distraction. Mirrors, shards of polished metal, even the glossy side of an old CD. These can confuse the infected if used correctly. One survivor described how they set up an array of broken mirrors in a narrow alley. When the infected approached, they seemed disoriented, their movements jerky and hesitant, as though they couldn't distinguish the reflections from reality. It bought just enough time for the survivor to slip away unnoticed. If you're scavenging, keep an eye out for anything reflective. It might just save your life. Another tactic I've been hearing about is the use of sound as a decoy. Sure, we all know about throwing a rock to create a distraction, but some survivors are taking it a step further. They're crafting makeshift noise traps using items like soda cans, fishing line, and small bells. One listener shared a setup where they tied cans together and strung them across an abandoned stairwell. When a group of infected wandered in, the noise triggered a frenzy that allowed the survivor to escape unnoticed. But be cautious. These traps can backfire if you don't have a clear exit strategy. Use them sparingly and only when you're certain you can get away. Now, let's talk about movement. You've probably noticed by now that the world doesn't feel as still as it used to. Roads shift, landmarks vanish, and pathways you swore were clear yesterday are suddenly blocked. It's not just your imagination. Survivors have reported strange disruptions in their usual routes. A clear stretch of highway might suddenly be littered with abandoned vehicles. Their hoods popped open as if scavenged long before anyone arrived. Forest trails have been described as leading nowhere, looping back on themselves or ending abruptly at impassable barriers. If you're relying on familiar paths, be prepared for them to betray you. I've also been hearing unsettling accounts of safe zones, turning out to be anything but. One survivor described finding a seemingly untouched farmhouse, intact windows, a well-stocked pantry, and no signs of recent activity. They decided to stay the night, thinking they'd found a rare haven. But as darkness fell, the air grew heavy, and the silence became unbearable. Then came the sound of footsteps upstairs. Not the erratic stumbling of the infected, but deliberate, measured steps. They didn't wait to find out who or what was making them. They fled, leaving everything behind. If something seems too good to be true out here, it probably is. Speaking of places to avoid, let me tell you about a new phenomenon being reported in urban areas. Survivors have been finding walls smeared with black, tar-like substance. It's not paint and it's not blood, at least not any blood we'd recognize. The substance seems to ooze from the cracks in buildings, pooling at the base of walls and staining the ground. Survivors who've come into contact with it describe an immediate sense of dread, followed by nausea and disorientation. If you see the substance, do not touch it. Avoid the area entirely if you can. Whatever it is, it's not natural and it's certainly not safe. Now let's address another oddity: lights in the distance. I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. Survivors are reporting flickering lights on the horizon. Sometimes blue, sometimes red, always faint and far away. They never seem to grow closer, no matter how far you walk. Some survivors have tried to investigate, only to find themselves disoriented and backtracking to where they started. The lights appear to move, almost like they're leading you somewhere. But where and for what purpose? No one stuck around long enough to find out, and frankly, I don't blame them. There are also whispers of unusual weather patterns. A sudden drop in temperature, frost forming in perfect circles on the ground, or brief but intense showers of glowing blue rain. One survivor described standing in a clearing when the rain began to fall. They said it felt warm, almost pleasant, but left behind faint, glowing stains on their clothing. Within minutes, the rain stopped, and the glow faded, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. If you notice anything unusual about the weather, take it as a sign to move quickly. The environment isn't just a backdrop anymore, it's part of the threat. Finally, I want to touch on something that's been nagging at me: the presence of tools and supplies that seem deliberately placed. Survivors have found pristine toolboxes in areas that should have been scavenged dry, along with cans of food that look fresh and untouched. One listener even found a fully stocked first aid kit in the middle of an otherwise empty road. It's tempting to think of these as lucky breaks, but I urge caution. Why would supplies like these be left behind? And by whom? If you take them, and I know it's hard not to, be prepared for the possibility that you've just walked into someone else's trap. Stay sharp, survivors. The world is changing faster than we can comprehend, and it's not giving us any time to catch up. Keep your wits about you, trust your instincts, and always have a backup plan. This fight isn't just against the infected anymore. It's against the very fabric of reality. Stay vigilant and stay alive. Survivors, let's talk about the rules, or rather, the fact that they're no longer rules. They're guidelines now, and shaky ones at best. Everything we thought we knew about how to stay alive, how to outsmart the infected, even how the environment reacts to us, is slipping through our fingers. The world has shifted under us, and we're left scrambling to catch up. Let's start with the infected. The shamblers, runners, and lurkers we've come to know, dreadfully predictable in their own way, are changing. Reports are coming in that some of them are learning, not just moving strategically or clustering deliberately like we've seen before, but actively adapting. One listener described a horrifying encounter where the infected seemed to use reflective surfaces, like broken mirrors and car windows, to confuse and trap their group. Another survivor detailed how the infected feigned inactivity, standing motionless until their group moved into the open. Once the trap was sprung, there was no outrunning them. It doesn't stop there. Survivors are reporting what can only be described as decoys. A single infected will wander into an area, appearing disoriented or injured, drawing attention while others circle around unseen. Whether this is deliberate coordination or instinct evolving to mimic strategy, it's deadly either way. If you see a lone infected behaving strangely, assume it's not alone. Assume it's a lure, and proceed accordingly. Then there's the matter of the terrain. I don't know how to explain it, but the land itself is no longer stable. Roads that were clear yesterday are now cracked and impassable. Trees seem to sprout in unnatural clusters overnight, forming barriers or choke points. In one chilling report, a survivor described watching a sinkhole form in real time, opening up mere feet away from them, as if the ground was reacting to their presence. Others have encountered paths that lead nowhere, trails that loop endlessly or seem to shift when retraced. If you're navigating unfamiliar territory, mark your way. Leave clear signs, and if those signs disappear or change, get out. Water sources are another growing concern. Rivers are moving faster, with some even reversing flow entirely. Lakes and ponds that once seemed safe are now teeming with strange, glowing residue, often accompanied by an overwhelming metallic tang in the air. A survivor reported finding a well they'd used before, only to discover the water had turned murky, with a faint blue glow emanating from its depths. Drinking it wasn't an option, and staying too close made them feel uneasy, like they were being watched. If your usual water source looks or smells off, don't take any chances. Find another, even if it means traveling farther than you're comfortable with. The skies aren't much safer. Storms are rolling in without warning, bringing with them strange phenomena. Lightning strikes that leave behind spiraling scorch marks. Rain that seems to evaporate midair, or worse, rain that glows faintly as it falls. Some survivors have reported feeling static in the air, like the world is charged with energy before these storms hit. If you see the clouds start to gather unnaturally fast, take cover. These storms don't just pass through, they leave changes in their wake. I've also been hearing about abandoned places that are anything but warehouses, offices, even suburban homes that seem untouched by time or decay, sitting in the middle of areas otherwise overrun with ruin. Survivors have described stepping into these spaces and feeling an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Everything is pristine, furniture arranged as if waiting for its owners, food in the cupboards that looks fresh, and clocks ticking in perfect rhythm. But the air is heavy, almost suffocating, and more often than not, these survivors report hearing faint, rhythmic clicking sounds while inside. My advice? Don't linger. These places are traps, whether set by other survivors or something far worse. Now let's turn to the behavior of the world itself. The silence is spreading. I've mentioned zones of oppressive quiet before, but they're becoming more common and larger in size. Survivors have described entering areas where not even the wind moves, where the only sound is their own breathing. One account detailed how even the crunch of leaves underfoot was muted, as though the environment was absorbing the noise. These zones are unpredictable, and leaving them is often harder than entering. If you find yourself in one, move quickly and deliberately. Don't stop to rest, and don't make any unnecessary noise. Finally, let's talk about the lights. Survivors across different regions are reporting strange flashes in the distance, brilliant and short-lived, like lightning but without a storm. In some cases, these lights are accompanied by faint vibrations in the ground, almost like a pulse. A particularly unnerving report described a group seeing a flash, followed by the immediate appearance of infected that hadn't been there moments before. Whether these lights are a signal, a trigger, or something else entirely, they're not to be ignored. All of this points to one thing: the world is no longer passive. It's responding, adapting, just like the infected. Whether it's some natural phenomenon, a side effect of whatever caused this outbreak, or something we can't even begin to understand, the rules are gone. What we're left with is chaos pretending to be order, and survival means staying one step ahead of whatever's coming next. Keep your wits about you, survivors. The world is watching, and it's changing the game. Survivors, let's talk about the signs. The world is littered with them, intentional, accidental, and inexplicable. They're etched into the walls of buildings, left in the dirt by hurried hands, and carved into trees like silent warnings. Some are subtle, some blatant, but all of them demand attention. In a world like ours, ignorance isn't just dangerous, it's fatal. Let's start with the physical signs left behind by other survivors. These are often the easiest to spot, but the hardest to interpret. Arrows scratched into concrete, spirals drawn with ash, and single words like run or trapped scrawled across doors. These markings aren't random. They're messages, sometimes warnings, sometimes bait. One survivor recently described finding a series of red handprints leading down an alley. Following them seemed like the only option, but at the end, they were greeted by an ambush, a trap laid by desperate people with no other way to survive. If you see a sign, stop. Evaluate its meaning, its placement. Ask yourself who left it and why. Then there are the signs that make less sense. These are the ones etched in perfect, unnatural symmetry, like spirals in the dirt or jagged lines that seem to cut into surfaces with precision too fine for human hands. One survivor sent in a report about finding dozens of these symbols burned into a clearing in the forest, perfectly spaced, as though a machine had stamped them into the earth. There were no tracks, no indication of who or what made them, just the markings and an overwhelming sense of unease. Avoid these if you can. They're not warnings, they're something else entirely, and I don't think we're meant to understand them. Signals aren't limited to the visual. There are auditory warnings too, though these are far more insidious. Survivors have mentioned hearing faint clicking noises, rhythmic and persistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, they sound mechanical, like the ticking of a distant clock, but the longer you listen, the more alive they seem. One survivor described following the sound, only to find themselves surrounded by infected, motionless but facing them as though waiting. If you hear clicking, don't follow it. Move in the opposite direction quickly and quietly. Speaking of sounds, let's talk about the hum. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but if you stand still long enough in certain areas, you can feel it more than hear it. A vibration just below the surface of perception. Survivors describe it as disorienting, almost hypnotic, making it hard to focus or think clearly. One listener detailed how their group found themselves in a neighborhood overtaken by this hum, unable to remember why they'd come there or how long they'd been wandering. It wasn't until they stumbled out that they realized hours had passed, and the infected had been following them silently the entire time. The hum isn't natural, and it's not something you can fight. If you feel it, leave the area immediately. Now let's turn to the sky. Survivors have reported strange patterns appearing in the clouds. Spirals, jagged lines, even what look like faces if you stare too long. They're not constant, but when they appear, they're impossible to ignore. One particularly chilling account came from a group traveling at night, who described seeing a massive spiral form above them, glowing faintly. As they watched, the infected in the area began moving in unison, all heading toward the same point as if drawn by an invisible force. The group didn't stay to see what would happen next, and neither should you. The signals aren't limited to what you can see or hear, either. There are patterns in the way the world itself behaves. Survivors have noticed that infected activity increases near certain landmarks. Old factories, abandoned hospitals, even isolated gas stations. These places aren't inherently dangerous on their own, but they seem to attract the infected in unnerving numbers. It's as if something about them resonates with the infection, drawing it closer. If you're near a site like this and notice infected clustering, leave. Whatever is happening there isn't worth investigating. One more thing, the lights. They're becoming more frequent. Those sudden, blinding flashes that leave you disoriented and blinking away after images. Survivors have reported seeing them in the distance, only to find strange symbols etched into the ground where the light originated. Others describe them as warnings, a prelude to infected activity. One particularly harrowing account detailed a survivor seeing the flash, only to find themselves pursued by infected that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. These lights are not natural and they're not safe. Treat them as you would any other threat, with caution and distance. The signs are everywhere. Survivors. They're in the ground, the air, the things we can see and hear and feel. Some of them are warnings, left by others like us trying to carve out a semblance of safety in this chaos. Others are something more, echoes of whatever is reshaping the world into something we barely recognize. The key is to pay attention. Notice the patterns, the repetitions. Learn to distinguish between what's meant to help you and what's meant to lure you in. It's a thin line, but it's the difference between making it to tomorrow and becoming another mark on the wall. Survivors, let's talk about the infected. Whatever we once knew or thought we knew about them is shifting. They're no longer the mindless, shambling creatures we first encountered. Over the past few weeks, I've noticed reports, patterns, and behaviors that suggest something more complex is at work. And I need you to pay close attention, because this evolution could mean the difference between staying alive and becoming one of them. Let's start with movement. The infected used to stumble blindly, chasing after any sound or movement without hesitation. Now, though, their actions are different. They're moving in packs more frequently, almost like hunting parties. Groups of 5, 10, sometimes more, have been seen traveling together with a sense of purpose. They're not just wandering aimlessly, they're tracking. Survivors have reported being followed for hours, even days, with the infected maintaining a consistent but unnerving distance. They don't always attack immediately, as if they're waiting for the right moment. And when they do attack, it's coordinated. You can't outrun strategy, survivors. You need to think smarter, faster, and stay ahead of their game. There's also the way they react to their surroundings. Previously, light and noise were the primary triggers. A shout, a gunshot, the beam of a flashlight, all guaranteed to draw them out. Now, it seems they've become more discerning. Survivors have reported incidents where infected ignored distant sounds, focusing instead on subtler cues. One group mentioned how a single dropped canteen in the woods brought infected out of the shadows, while a gunshot 100 yards away didn't elicit the same response. It's as if they're prioritizing, targeting what feels immediate and achievable rather than blindly reacting to everything around them. Another thing that's been cropping up in reports is their ability to mimic. Survivors have shared encounters with infected that appeared to imitate human behaviors, standing still, tilting their heads, even mimicking the sound of footsteps. One particularly unsettling account came from a survivor who described hearing a faint whistle while traveling through an empty street. At first, they thought it was another survivor signaling, but when they followed the sound, they realized it was an infected, standing motionless and emitting a soft, rhythmic whistle. Whether it's intentional or not, this mimicry is dangerous. It lulls you into a false sense of security, makes you think there's something human left in them when there isn't. Let's talk about their awareness of traps. Survivors have started noticing that infected are avoiding obvious pitfalls. Spikes, wire snares, even open manholes that would have taken them down before. It's as though they've learned what to look out for, adapting to the methods we've been using against them. And in some cases, it seems they're even using traps themselves. There's a chilling account from a group traveling through an abandoned school, where they found desks and chairs arranged in such a way that forced them down a narrow hallway. At the end, a horde was waiting, silent and still until the group was cornered. This isn't random behavior. It's deliberate and it's terrifying. The infected are also showing signs of communication, not in words or language, but in movements and sounds. Survivors have observed what can only be described as signals: hand gestures, sudden jerks of the head, guttural noises that seem to convey meaning. One survivor described watching a group of infected standing in a circle, motionless, until one emitted a low growl. Instantly, the entire group turned and began moving in the same direction. It's not clear what they're communicating or how, but it's happening, and we need to acknowledge it. Then there's the way they interact with the environment. Survivors have described infected gathering around certain landmarks: water towers, factories, even seemingly mundane locations like empty parking lots. In these places, they don't attack. They just stand there, staring at something unseen, as if waiting. One particularly strange report involved a group of infected encircling a large tree with glowing sap, their heads tilted back as though they were reverent. I don't know what this means, but it's not normal. It's not natural. It's something we need to be wary of. Finally, let's address the most chilling development. Some infected seem to be targeting survivors in calculated ways. There's a growing number of reports of survivors being stalked, not just followed, but hunted. These infected don't attack immediately. They observe, they wait, they strike when their prey is at its weakest. One survivor recounted being pursued through the ruins of a city by a single infected. It never got close, never made a sound, but it was always there, just out of sight. When the survivor finally made it to safety, they found fresh scratches on the door they'd barricaded, as if the infected had been testing the barrier. Survivors, this isn't just evolution, it's adaptation. The infected are changing, and they're changing fast. Whether it's the infection itself mutating or some external force guiding them, I can't say. But what I do know is this: the old rules no longer apply. The infected are no longer mindless. They're learning, adapting, and becoming something far more dangerous. Keep your wits about you, stay unpredictable, and most importantly, trust nothing about their behavior. Whatever is driving them, it's not hunger alone anymore. It's something deeper, something darker, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Survivors, let's shift focus to the land itself. The infected aren't the only things changing. Our surroundings are warping in ways that defy understanding. The earth, the sky, even the air feels alive, and not in the way we once knew. These aren't mere coincidences or natural phenomena. The world we thought we understood is unraveling, and we're left to piece together what it's becoming. In the last few days, I've encountered reports from survivors who've noticed strange patterns in the terrain: grass growing in spirals, trees with bark that twists unnaturally, and stretches of road that shimmer under the light, as if covered in a thin layer of oil. It's not just the appearance of these things, it's the feeling they evoke. Survivors describe an inexplicable sense of unease when they come across these areas, as though they're being watched or worse, drawn in. One group described finding a field where every blade of grass pointed in the same direction, toward a single, gnarled tree at its center. Beneath that tree, they found nothing but soil, soft and freshly turned. What does it mean? I don't have an answer, but it's happening everywhere. Let's talk about the fog. Not the kind that rolls in on a cold morning, but the dense, heavy mist that seems to rise from nowhere and lingers like it's alive. Survivors have reported this fog behaving unnaturally, moving against the wind, clustering in specific areas, even dissipating when approached, only to reappear elsewhere. There are whispers that standing in it too long can cause disorientation, even hallucinations. Some say they've heard voices in the fog, faint and distant, calling their names or repeating words they don't understand. I don't know if this is paranoia or something more, but if you see the fog, move quickly. Don't linger. Don't listen. Then there's the water. Rivers and lakes aren't what they used to be. Survivors near the old industrial zones report seeing water that glows faintly in the dark, a soft blue hue that ripples unnaturally. Some streams have reversed their flow entirely, running uphill or circling back on themselves. One survivor described a pond that, from a distance, appeared normal, but up close, the surface shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting a sky that wasn't the one above them. And it's not just the water itself. Fish and other aquatic creatures are behaving strangely. Schools of fish moving in perfect, synchronized patterns, even in stagnant water. They shouldn't be alive, let alone acting like that. The air is changing too. There are places where it feels heavier, almost suffocating. Survivors have described it as feeling electric, like a storm is about to break, but the sky remains clear. In some areas, a metallic tang lingers in the air, sharp and unnatural. People report that these places are eerily silent. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive stillness. And then there are the whispers. Survivors have told me about faint, almost imperceptible sounds carried on the wind. Voices just out of earshot, murmuring words they can't make out. Whether it's real or imagined, it's enough to unsettle even the most hardened among us. There's something happening underground too. Sinkholes are appearing in clusters, some small enough to step over, others large enough to swallow entire buildings. One survivor described a network of tunnels revealed by a collapsed road, the walls smooth and unnatural, as if carved with precision. They didn't stay long enough to explore, but they heard sounds, echoes that didn't belong, clicking noises, and what they swore were faint footsteps. If the infected are evolving, who's to say what might be happening beneath our feet? And then there are the symbols. Survivors have been finding them etched into walls, carved into trees, even burned into the ground. Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that defy easy description. They're appearing in places where the infected seem to gather, or where the environment feels most altered. One survivor came across a stretch of road where every car had the same symbol scratched into the paint. An angular spiral, each one identical in size and shape. What's unsettling is that no one knows who or what is making them. Are they warnings? Messages? Markers of some kind? I don't know, but they're multiplying. Some survivors are connecting these phenomena to the infected, theorizing that the infection isn't just in people, it's spreading to the earth itself. The glowing sap in trees, the pulsating ground, the changing behavior of animals. All of it could be linked. Others think it's something entirely different, something older than the infection, something waking up in the chaos we've created. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but the patterns are hard to ignore. Whatever the cause, these changes are reshaping the world we thought we knew, and they're doing it fast. Survivors, I don't tell you these things to scare you, though I know it's hard not to feel afraid. I tell you because knowledge is our greatest weapon right now. The infected are dangerous, yes, but so is the world itself. Pay attention to your surroundings. If something feels off, trust that instinct. Avoid the areas where these changes are most pronounced. Mark them on your maps if you can, and share that knowledge with others. We're up against more than just the infected. The very fabric of reality seems to be fraying, and it's up to us to navigate this new, unpredictable world. Stay sharp, stay observant, and most importantly, stay alive. Survivors, it seems the longer we endure, the more the world reveals just how alien it has become. Let me tell you about some of the most recent encounters I've heard about. Moments that stick in the mind like barbs and leave us questioning what we know. A small group of survivors moving through an abandoned industrial park stumbled upon a structure that wasn't there weeks ago. They described it as a tall, skeletal framework of metal beams that shimmered faintly in the dim light. It was utterly silent, save for the occasional hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. The group didn't approach. They didn't dare. But what unnerved them most was the presence of infected standing motionless around the base, their heads tilted back as if gazing upward. They didn't react to the survivors, didn't move at all, and the group wisely chose to leave before testing their luck. Structures like this one have been appearing in scattered reports, always accompanied by that same eerie behavior from the infected. Speaking of the infected, their coordination is becoming more deliberate and more intelligent. There's a pattern emerging in their actions, though it's not always clear what they're working toward. Survivors reported seeing a cluster of infected gathered around a bonfire that no human had lit. The fire burned low, and the infected simply stood around it, unmoving. One survivor claimed to hear faint, rhythmic clicking sounds coming from the group, though they couldn't determine its source. Whether this is some form of communication or something far stranger, it's clear that these aren't the mindless creatures we once believed them to be. And it's not just their behavior that's changing, it's their appearance. Reports are coming in of infected with strange, glowing marks on their skin. These marks resemble the symbols that have been cropping up in the environment, spirals and jagged lines that pulse faintly in low light. Survivors have speculated that these markings might indicate a different stage of infection or perhaps some form of hierarchy among the infected. I'm not sure what to make of it, but if you encounter one of these marked individuals, proceed with extreme caution. Let's shift gears for a moment. In the southern regions, closer to the mountains, there's been talk of something even more bizarre. Survivors have described what they call mirage zones, areas where reality seems to warp and shift. One man recounted walking through a forest where the trees appeared to ripple like water, their branches bending and twisting in ways that defied physics. Another survivor described a street where every surface reflected light, even in the pitch dark, creating a disorienting maze of reflections. These zones are unpredictable, appearing and disappearing without warning, and they're often accompanied by a sense of overwhelming dread. If you encounter a mirage zone, my advice is simple: leave quickly. Animals, too, are acting in ways that defy logic. A survivor in the northern plains told me about a herd of deer standing perfectly still, all facing the same direction, as if awaiting some unseen signal. When the group tried to bypass them, the deer turned in unison to watch them go. There was no aggression, no movement beyond the turning of their heads, but the experience left the group shaken. Birds have been seen circling specific areas, not in the chaotic patterns of scavengers, but in precise, synchronized loops. Some survivors believe these animals are being influenced by the same forces affecting the infected and the environment. Whether that's true or not, it's clear that the natural order is unraveling. Then there are the whispers, those faint, unintelligible murmurs that seem to follow you in the quiet. Survivors have heard them in abandoned buildings, deep in the woods, even out in the open plains. They're never loud enough to make out the words, but they're there, just on the edge of hearing. One woman described walking through an overgrown neighborhood when she heard her name whispered from an upstairs window. When she looked, there was no one there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Whispers like these are becoming more common, and they're not something to be dismissed lightly. And finally, let's talk about the lights. Survivors across different regions have reported seeing flashes of light in the night sky. They're not like lightning, and they don't resemble anything mechanical. Some describe them as bursts of color, while others see only a brief, blinding white. What's most unsettling is what follows the lights: total silence. No wind, no distant sounds of wildlife or infected, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. Survivors have learned to treat these moments as warnings, as precursors to something worse. If you see the lights, stay hidden and stay alert. The world is showing us its new face, survivors, and it's one that we can barely begin to understand. Every day brings new anomalies, new behaviors, new threats. We're not just surviving against the infected anymore. We're navigating a reality that's rewriting its own rules. Keep your wits about you, and remember, the more we share, the better chance we have of making sense of this madness. Survivors, I'm going to dive right into what I've gathered from reports and my own observations. It seems the boundaries of what we thought was possible are crumbling faster than we can comprehend. The infected, the land, the very air around us. Everything is changing in ways that feel deliberate, almost like the world itself is trying to tell us something. Let's talk about the infected first. They've always been a threat, but their movements are becoming selective. Survivors near the old coastal highway have reported clusters of infected avoiding direct sunlight, sticking to shadows like it's an instinct they've recently developed. One survivor described an unnerving encounter while scavenging through an old factory. He said the infected inside didn't charge or groan like we've come to expect. Instead, They followed him silently, their heads tilted slightly, as though watching his every move. When he tried to leave, they blocked the exits, not aggressively, but with an eerie precision. He managed to escape through a vent, but the memory of their behavior haunts him. It's as if they're testing us, learning. Now, about the air itself. I've received numerous accounts of what survivors are calling dead zones. These are areas where the air feels heavier, almost electric, like it's charged with some unseen force. Survivors walking through these zones report feelings of nausea, disorientation, and an overwhelming sense of dread. What's worse, these dead zones are spreading. One survivor swore he saw faint, shimmering waves in the air when he entered one, almost like heat rising off pavement. He described hearing faint hums, and when he tried to trace the sound, it always seemed to come from just out of sight. He left quickly, and I advise you to do the same if you encounter anything similar. The symbols continue to appear, etched into walls, trees, even the ground itself. Some are spirals, others jagged lines or geometric patterns. Survivors have started mapping their locations, and a disturbing pattern is emerging. They're all centered around areas of high infected activity or those unnatural environmental changes. One group near the northeastern forests found a massive spiral burned into a clearing, with no visible source of fire. They stayed long enough to document it before leaving, and they claimed to have felt an oppressive weight, as though the air itself was pressing down on them. The rivers and lakes are another source of growing unease. Reports are coming in about bodies of water glowing faintly at night, casting an unnatural light that doesn't seem to have a source. Survivors who've approached these waters describe a feeling of being watched, and in some cases, they've seen movement beneath the surface. One survivor swore he saw shapes swimming just out of view, larger than any fish or animal he could name. He left without investigating further, a decision I think we can all agree was wise. Then there's the issue of disappearing landmarks. This isn't a metaphor. Entire structures are vanishing. Survivors traveling familiar routes have reported returning to find buildings, bridges, and even entire stretches of road gone, as though they never existed. One man described returning to an abandoned gas station where he'd hidden supplies, only to find nothing but an empty lot overgrown with weeds. There were no signs of demolition, no debris, just absence. It's as if the world is actively erasing itself, leaving us fewer and fewer anchors to hold on to. I've also heard whispers about survivors going missing under strange circumstances. These aren't isolated incidents of people being taken by infected or ambushed by hostile groups. In many cases, their camps were left undisturbed, supplies untouched, no signs of struggle. One group near the western ridge woke up to find one of their own gone. His bedroll was still there, and his gear was packed neatly beside it. The only clue was a faint trail of footprints leading into the woods, where they ended abruptly. This has happened enough times that it's hard to dismiss as coincidence. Let's not forget the animals. Their behavior continues to shift in ways that defy explanation. Survivors near the Central Plains reported flocks of birds gathering in enormous numbers, circling overhead in synchronized patterns before suddenly scattering in all directions. Others have described seeing animals staring at them for unnaturally long periods, unblinking, as though studying them. Even the insects seem affected. One group in the south described swarms of fireflies forming intricate shapes in the night, shapes that resembled the symbols we've been seeing. Lastly, there's the sky. Survivors have reported seeing strange formations in the clouds, spirals, and other unnatural patterns that don't seem to move with the wind. Some have described flashes of light or colors they can't quite name. Whatever is happening above us, it feels connected to everything else. The infected, the symbols, the environmental changes. It's all part of a puzzle we can't yet see the full picture of. The world is unraveling, survivors, but we're still here, still fighting to understand it. Whatever these changes mean, they're not random. Keep your eyes open and your instincts sharp. If you notice something that feels off, trust that feeling. The world isn't the same anymore, and it's not going to get any easier to navigate. Stay safe and remember, you're not alone in this, no matter how isolated it might feel. Survivors, as we come to the end of this broadcast, I want to leave you with a few thoughts and observations that may help you navigate this fractured world. The patterns we're witnessing, the spirals, the symbols, the evolving infected, the dead zones, they all seem connected, but we're still piecing it together. There's a rhythm to the chaos if you look closely enough, a thread that runs through every inexplicable event. It's as if the world is speaking to us in a language we don't yet understand. Let's talk about trust. I've heard from groups who've banded together, finding strength in numbers, only to be betrayed by the weakest link. And yet, I've also heard stories of individuals risking everything to save a stranger, forging bonds that defy this grim reality. Trust is a double-edged sword, but isolation can cut just as deeply. Balance caution with compassion, and remember that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can be the difference between life and death. I want to revisit the topic of the infected, especially their coordination. What we once thought of as mindless creatures are becoming something else. Survivors have reported infected forming barriers, herding others into traps, and even retreating when they're outnumbered. One particularly chilling account described an infected standing motionless at the edge of a clearing, watching a group of survivors but never advancing. Felt like a warning, like it knew they had nowhere to run. If this behavior continues, it's going to change the way we think about survival entirely. Then there's the environment. We've seen landscapes shift, water flow in impossible ways, and landmarks vanish as if plucked from existence. But there's something deeper at play. Survivors near the eastern mountains reported hearing whispers carried on the wind, voices speaking in unison but in no language they could identify. They described feeling an overwhelming urge to follow the sound, though none of them dared to. If you encounter anything similar, resist the pull. Curiosity may cost you more than you're willing to pay. Another pressing concern is the phenomenon of missing people. It's not just individuals wandering off or being taken by infected. Entire groups have vanished without a trace. Camps left untouched, fires still burning, supplies undisturbed. It's as though they've been swallowed whole by the earth. These disappearances are happening more frequently, and they're not confined to any specific region. If you're part of a group, stay vigilant. Keep track of each other, and don't assume that safety in numbers makes you immune. I also want to address the strange light phenomena. Survivors have described flashes of light in the distance, often accompanied by a low hum or vibration. Some believe these are remnants of old technology coming back to life. Others think they're warnings or signals. Whatever they are, approach them with extreme caution. We don't know their purpose, and speculation can only take us so far. Lastly, let's not forget the importance of resilience. The world is testing us, pushing us to our limits, but it's in these moments of despair that we find what we're truly capable of. Every small victory, a scavenged can of food, a night spent safely behind fortified walls, a connection made with another survivor, is a testament to your strength. Hold on to those moments. They're the threads that keep us tethered to humanity. The road ahead is uncertain, survivors, but one thing is clear. This world isn't done changing, and neither are we. Pay attention to the patterns, trust your instincts, and adapt to whatever comes next. Remember, you're not just surviving for yourself. Every step you take, every choice you make, shapes the future for those who follow. Stay sharp, stay strong, and most importantly, stay human. This is Atlas, signing off for now. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your feet moving forward. We're still here, and that means something.